All right, everyone. Thank you all again for coming. You've heard it before, but you'll hear it again. My name is Christy Barnwell, Associate Professor of History here, and we're doing our Sources of Conflict series. And today we're going to be talking about the Hamas charters. We have people online in the room and here as well. So thank you so much for spending a Tuesday afternoon with me. So we've covered several topics already. They're all available online. One of the things that I had initially thought about but needed more time to really think about was the question of the Hamas charters, right? So we've been hearing a lot about Hamas in the news. Whatever we read gives us some oversight, but like Hamas has been around since 1987 officially, and it has roots going back a little bit further. And so because no organization is static, it's important to sort of look at various ways of thinking about how they grow or change in response to instances they're facing. So what we're doing today is going to talk about background to Hamas. If you'll hit the outline for me, the next. Talk about the background of Hamas, its origins in the Muslim Brotherhood, and then the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. Then we'll talk about the Intifada and the rise of Hamas. We'll actually also talk about the second Intifada as well. And then we'll talk about the evolution of Hamas over time in response to changing circumstances on the ground. And one of the works that I came across while I was prepping for this was a work by, his name is Khalid Hroub, and he is, I think, has multiple works out. And one of the things that he talks about is something that I had noticed, which is that there's really, and which made me want to take a deeper dive into this, is that when we hear the news talking about Hamas and Hamas's stance on things, they're always referencing the 1988 charter and almost never actually referencing the 2017 charter. And they are very different documents and outline a very different set of approaches a set of approaches to the question of what's happening in terms of Hamas's politics, its strategies, its relationship with people in the world, and all of those kinds of things, right? So I really thought this was a time for both me to get a refresher on what was going on and then to sort of dig into what was happening. And one of the things that Hroub notes in his thing, and I don't have it in my notes here, it's in my notes upstairs, which is fine, is ultimately that what he finds to be the case is that there's really sort of like, you get the neoliberal West that emphasizes this old vision of Hamas and has just sort of almost refused to engage with this idea that Hamas is possibly having evolved and been responsive. And that's interesting and important because in political science in particular, one of the things that when we were interviewing somebody for international relations some years ago, they study conflict as a key part of what they do. And they were talking about something that I was sort of familiar with, but gave me further information on, is that a lot of times we see in Islamist movements and other movements like this, that over time, they really do, as they're allowed to participate in the political system, they moderate themselves to become more civic oriented rather than resistance oriented. And so it's interesting to see whether or not, hint, I think there is an answer to this that says Hamas has done this, whether or not it's the exclusion from the political arena that leads to the creation of these radical violent responses, and the inclusion in the political arena leads to greater normalization of strategies that fit within these other kinds of more pragmatic realms. So that's what I think we're going to see as we move through this today. So we'll click. So we're going to start with the Muslim Brotherhood and its origins. So we're going to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, Egypt. And so the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood movement is a man named Hassan al-Banna. He was born in 1906 and he would die in 1949. And he was a part of, in Egypt, in the early part of the 20th century, they are under a constitutional, a constitutional monarchy but that monarchy is under the control of the veiled mandate. That is a mandate behind the scenes. The British government is sort of controlling and influencing a lot of what the Egyptian government is. There's a lot of resentment in this time in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East of the overwhelming influence and control that the West is exerting over the lands in Egypt and the Middle East. The other thing that's also going on is that this is at the tail end of a 75, 80 years of major reforms in the Ottoman Empire and in Egypt. They're connected, but they're not directly they're sort of separate. It's a whole other story. Take my 161. But one of the things that had happened was in the 19th century, there was a really important shift in the way that the Ottoman Empire and the Egyptian government saw themselves in terms of their political power and their might. They noticed that while in the 15th and 16th centuries, they had been like the most powerful empire in Europe, by the time we get to the 18th and 19th century, they're not winning all their wars anymore, and they don't have as much influence and economic power. And so the response to that in the first half of the 19th century through the remainder of that century is something called the reorganization, defensive developmentalism, this idea that they want to, they're looking at the West and saying, you guys are winning the wars and you have more influence. What are the things that allow us to do that too? How do we take some inspiration from what's working for you guys or what we think is working for you all and bring that to us while also maintaining a certain level of our own distinct identity, right? And within predominantly Muslim areas, such as the Ottoman Empire and in Egypt, where we've got a lot of Islamic learning, there's this idea or these debates around what is modernity and what relationship does modernity have to Islam, okay? And there's a whole lots of scholars go into different debates about this. But Hassan al-Banna in 1906 is born into this intellectual milieu. And what he is sort of the inheritor of is this idea of Islamic modernism that he combines with ideas of Salafism. I'll tell you what that is in a minute. But he's trying to form a political, he wants to return to an idea where Islam is fused with the political and everyday sense of life. But he doesn't want to go all the way back to the 7th century and give up, all of the technologies, all of the hygiene, all of the things that we've learned, right? He doesn't want to reject the present. What he argues for is that in terms of Islamic modernity, that Islam is actually compatible with modernity. That the individual must use their rational mind, which God gives them, to perform what's known as ijtihad. That is to review and struggle through the sources to make sense of them, and to say, what of these new things that are modern are compatible with Islam? And if they're compatible, we can embrace them. And if they're not compatible, then we reject them. But we have to do that with our rational mind. So that's the Islamic modernism kind of idea there. The Salafism is an idea that you want to return back to and reform Islam, that over time, from the 7th century to the 20th century, there have been these innovations and changes and practices that don't fit with the original ideas of Islam. So Salafism doesn't necessarily imagine that you are going to return back to the 7th century, but it is an attempt to say we need to reform Islam, get rid of the stuff that is crept in, and move our lives and our values closer to the kind of life that is embedded in the values of Islam, such as Muhammad and his companions lived under, right? So he's combining these two things. First, we've got to reform Islam, and we've got to keep in mind that Islam is can be reconciled with modern life values and so on, right? And in the as he comes about in the 1920s, he's living at a time when there's a lot of nationalist politics. Egypt is trying to throw off British rule. The Brits are trying to hold on to Egypt as closely as they can. And between the 1920s and the 1940s, there would be this continuous struggle between Britain trying to pull the strings and keep its influences there, and Egyptians trying to say, no, we want to be a nationalist state, and so on. So he grows up in the middle of this. He becomes professional in the middle of this, and this is sort of the movement that he founds in 1922 in this kind of milieu. Now, that is one of the pieces of their platform is the rejection of Western dominance, the revival of Islamic society, the rejection of innovation for innovation's sake, right? And an adherence to Islam-based government. That is Sharia law, is the conception of that. And by the late 1950s and 60s, after his death, the movement in Egypt in particular would become increasingly militant, right? Now, started in 1922, but it was then, we'll take the next slide, established early connections with Palestine from the outset. So the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood was to establish chapters all through first the Arab Middle East and ideally throughout the Islamic world, because this was, they didn't want to necessarily operate under just national kinds of lines. They saw national lines as the result of imperial interests, right? What they wanted was to return to an idea where all of the Islamic world is united in its goal to establish Islamic sort of existence. So they sent all these chapters off to different places. In 1935, there was already the beginning of the Muslim Brotherhood making contact in the Mandate period with groups in Palestine and sort of talking about establishing a chapter. So as early as 1935, they were having conversations. And by 1945, we have the first chapter that was established in Jerusalem, which then within the next 2 years expanded to 25 groups all over the Mandate of Palestine that associated with the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini here was an elite based in Jerusalem of Palestinian origin. He was a nationalist and a mufti. That is, he believed in the creation of a Palestinian, like an Arab state, and shifting towards the idea of a Palestinian state explicitly. And he was also a mufti. That is, somebody trained in Islamic jurisprudence who issues decisions and that people come to on day-to-day life issues. And he was of a notable family. And so he was a member and helped organize some of these different chapters. After 1948, which is what? The Nakba, the catastrophe for Palestinians. After 1948, the Muslim Brotherhood in the West Bank, that is attached to Jordan, this was the Mandate map, but so the West Bank area is attached to Jordan during this time. So after 1948, the Muslim Brotherhood continued to operate in the West Bank and under Jordanian rule, and then in Gaza under Egyptian rule. Now in Jordan, it was fine. There weren't as many problems with the Muslim Brotherhood. They were able to operate without any political interference. In Egypt and Gaza, it was a different story because the government there was searching to suppress the Muslim Brotherhood as a movement. And this would continue under, that was first the constitutional government and then monarchy and then in the republic. So the Muslim Brotherhood really had to be more of an underground militant movement. We're talking about Gaza because it was excluded from civic and political society. Then after 1967, the West Bank and Gaza were both occupied by Israel. And the Muslim Brotherhood focused on its focus on religious revival did not necessarily resonate in the 60s and 70s with populations in Palestine as much as it did as the idea of the PLO's secular version of nationalism. So in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the predominant ideology, we get to the very late 60s and it really kind of dies out in the 70s. The predominant ideology is this idea of Arab nationalism and Arab socialism that is very secular and focuses on the sense of shared identity as Arabs is the predominant kind of way of operating. And so the Muslim Brotherhood can operate, but it doesn't have the level of popularity and reach in Egypt or even in Palestine, occupied Palestine, or any of these other countries, as well as something like the PLO, which was much more secular, sort of looked into leftist, socialist, Marxist ideology and so on. The Muslim Brotherhood continued to operate, but it operated just more or less as a charitable and civic organization. And while Israel would actively attempt to dismantle the militant organizations through the 70s, the Muslim Brotherhood was viewed as much less of a threat. It wasn't really on Israel's radar as far as like wanting to dismantle it or do anything much about it. The Muslim Brotherhood offered charitable services. It developed and maintained charitable organizations, nursery schools, kindergartens. It built mosques throughout areas of occupied Palestine. It provided loans for university education. So if you wanted to go to college, the Muslim Brotherhood would do that. It would also copy your books, violate copyright, give you your books so you could go to school without having to pay for those books. And through that, it was able to expand its social network through religious charitable networks. And by 1987, it had significantly expanded in its reach and its abilities. So next slide. So here, just as a reminder, we've got 1948 to 1967. So the West Bank is attached to Jordan, Gaza is attached to Egypt. And here we have occupied Sinai and Gaza after 67, occupied West Bank, and of course, this is the Golan Heights, occupied Syria. Okay. All right. So, 1987 signals the beginning of Hamas. There was in 1987 a sustained grassroots movement organized. It was organized as it was almost spontaneous. It just sort of like crept out of nowhere, it seemed. And the Intifada means sort of an uprising, but it also is like the shaking off. And it's you rise up and you shake off, you can shake off your sort of the way that you might have become complacent under the occupation. You shake off sort of your frustration or your complacency or your exhaustion, and you rise up with that shaking off, right? Now, this event was triggered by the murder of 4 Palestinian laborers who were killed by an Israeli vehicle, and it was presumed that this occurred on purpose, in Jabalia. Jabalia is in Gaza, and they were killed on December 6th. The next day, there were demonstrations, and a young man named Hatem Abu Sisi, who was 17 years old, was shot by an Israeli soldier during that demonstration. And it triggered this larger expanded, the uprisings quickly expanded everywhere. Demonstrations went everywhere. And it was an expression of anger and frustration of 20 years of occupation, and demonstrations were just started in Gaza, and then they just flew all over the West Bank. And Israel responded to this with what Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister at the time, referred to as the Iron Fist policy. They used military and police forces to arrest protesters in large numbers. They used live ammunition to fire on protesters. They extended curfews, that is, shut towns down to minimize movement. In 1988, it shut down universities and schools for an extended period of time. And I know by this room here that people do not like being denied the right to school and learn, right? You want that, right? That made people mad. They shut down these schools for an extended period of time. And in response, there was this formation of these popular committees in neighborhoods, towns, and villages that were there to serve, using a lot of the connections the Muslim Brotherhood had created, there to serve as mutual aid societies. So they developed funds to help share out to get people out of jail. They would, I saw one person who was growing up during this time talk about how before the Intifada, if police were harassing and arresting a Palestinian, nobody would have intervened. But during the Intifada, people went directly and intervened and sort of helped to protect that person. So it was like this moment of everybody kind of coming together help one another during this time. They would share out food and other resources. So villagers would collect materials and collect foods so that when the cities got shut down and they couldn't move food back and forth, that they would work together to get food access to various places that were cut off. They coordinated medical relief and education so that education could continue. And it was described, this young man, Khalid Farraj, described it as a profound solidarity that was experienced throughout the occupied territories. And it was at the very beginning of this movement that Hamas emerged. Hamas is the Harakat AlMuqawama al-Islamiyya. And the Hamas is the acronym that says, that refers to strength, right? And so in English, the Islamic Resistance Movement. And there was a group of Muslim Brotherhood leaders who got together who got together amongst themselves in December of 1987 to say that they had to start standing up to Israeli organized occupation forces and coordinating their efforts to do that. There was a generational divide that had been building in the 70s, where the older generation that had established the Muslim Brotherhood had sort of emphasized the civic organization. And by the time we get to this period, there's a younger group of people in their 30s and 40s who are saying, no, enough is enough. We need to take things into our own hands. We need to be more militant in our resistance, that this is not getting us anywhere. And the leaders who met to coordinate this effort came from places that are now probably familiar to all of us because of the Gaza war. So they came from Khan Yunis, Gaza City, Beit Hanun, Rafah, Nusayrat camp. And they organized their contacts with people in the West Bank and began issuing leaflets under the name of Hamas. And they identified themselves explicitly as a branch sort of connected to, but a little bit distinct from the Muslim Brotherhood. That way, if Hamas failed, the Muslim Brotherhood would collapse. But if it succeeded, then great, right? So they didn't want to get rid of that idea. One of the founding members was Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. He would be arrested in 1989. And so you get this founding group who get started in the resistance. And by 1989, Israel starts rounding them up, arresting them, deporting them in the years that follow. But because they had established this really broad grassroots network, they were able to keep up and fill in the gaps themselves to keep their movement going. Now, Israel itself has a significant part in its responsibility for Hamas coming into being. And so part of it was they ignored the Muslim Brotherhood. They didn't worry about it, right? But by the 70s, the Israeli government started looking for opportunities to sort of break the power of the PLO and the Palestinian secular left movement. And so I think it was in 2000 something. I don't have the date here, but the Israeli governor of Gaza, military governor of Gaza, reported, told a New York Times reporter that in the 70s, when he was the military governor over Gaza, that he had been directed at the behest of the Israeli government to start funneling money out to Muslim Brotherhood leaders to start establishing this other group and to get them going so that they would have the power to sort of break or undercut the power of the PLO and other leftist groups. So they fed into this for a while. Okay, so the Intifada went on, and then it collapsed or sort of faded out for a while, and it faded out because of it didn't collapse. I should say what happened was. The PLO leader Yasser Arafat at the time started conversations with the Israeli government to establish what became known as the Oslo Accords. And in 1994-95, there are these talks. There's two accords. There's a first round and a second round. They're going to get these accords in place, and they're going to come up with a solution for a plan to make a plan, okay, down the road. So it's a plan to make a plan is what it comes down to. Now, the PLO suffered when this was revealed and the extent to which this was decided upon. First, it had shut down the Intifada because there were peace talks going on, right? But the second part of this was that half of like a good chunk of, I shouldn't say half, that's a precise number, a good number of the people on the executive committee of the PLO actually resigned because they were not happy with how the Oslo Accords went. So there was in the 90s sort of this tentative, like there was frustration with the PLO, and more people started looking at other alternatives, which would give Hamas a certain amount of strength in the 90s. There was a lot of anger about the decision to establish the Oslo Accords the way that it did. In 2000, we would run into the second, how are we doing on? Good. In 2000, we run into the second Intifada. And it came about for a number of reasons, but one of them was the collapse of the Camp David summit. So the plan to make a plan, they had another meeting to figure out what they were going to do with the plan. And they could not come to agreement on any of the issues, Israel or Palestine, on any of the issues that were central to a peace agreement. These are border contiguity and territory, that is the ability to connect the territories together. The question of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif for Palestinians as the capital. The question of Palestinian refugees and their right of return. Israeli security, didn't want to let Palestinian security have too much power in any of these places. And then also the question of settlement. So all of the key stuff that kept the conflict going, they weren't able to get anything done in that summit in the early part of 2000. So that was one point. And then the second that occurred was that in September of 2000, Ariel Sharon marched, took a delegation along with police to the Haram al-Sharif, which was seen as a move to explicitly provoke action on the part of Palestine and to justify some sort of new military action and a number of other plans. So in response, there was an uptick in violence. There were demonstrations, there were protests, gas, rubber bullets, demonstrations that occurred in Jerusalem and then broke out through the West Bank, Gaza, and even in Israel under like Arab citizens of Palestinian descent within Israel were also demonstrating. And so by October, violence continued to expand. People were dying in large numbers. Over 1,000 people were killed of Palestinian descent. And ultimately, in 2005, there was a disengagement plan. And this is when Gaza, the settlers in Gaza, were forcibly removed by the Israeli army, and the blockade of Gaza began in 2005-06. So that is the moment when they wall off Gaza and establish the blockade that we can see here by land, air. Okay. In the same time, the Palestinian government agreed to have elections. And this would be the first time that Hamas would participate in national level elections. They participated in local municipal kinds of elections, but they decided in 2006 they would do so. And Hroub, the scholar that I talked about, analyzed their various platform documents that came out in 2006 and argued that you could already see significant shifts in what Hamas was trying to do to create unity or create connection with the PLO or with the Palestinian Authority, and to change the way it appears to the international community and what they're doing. And so in 2006, they hold these elections. And if we go to the next one, they hold these elections, and we end up with a split vote between Hamas and Fatah. Neither one of them wins a full election, like wins a majority. But Hamas wins 44.5% of the votes. Fatah gets 41.43%. And then the others make another small percentage of the votes. And then the seats are then divvied up, as you can see along here. Hamas would make the argument that, hey, we should form a coalition unity government of some kind. But this gets rejected. And there continues to be a split government with the PA running the West Bank primarily, and Gaza is run by Hamas. And then during this time, there was also a plan for elections to be held in 2021, but that was indefinitely postponed. And we have not had elections at all. Was it 2021 or Well, let's see. There were supposed to be elections in 2011. Those didn't happen because the PA thought they were going to lose. And then they promised again in 2021 they would have elections, and those were indefinitely postponed again and again. And so Fatah has been very worried about, the PA has been very worried about what will happen if elections take place. And so what we're going to look at here then is to talk a little bit about what happens with Hamas in its government position and what we can see in terms of the transformation of 88 to 2017. All right. So point out, I've got my summary of each article here. I'm not going to cover all of that. If you'll pick. So what I did is, it's interesting because while the new charter is has more articles in it, it is actually significantly shorter. For those who are watching at home, in the next slide, you can actually click on the charters to open them if you want to see the actual charters. But in 1988, just sort of the general framework of the charter, Hamas expresses its views as an armed resistance movement. It is very ideological in the way that it frames it. And it, in comparison, if we look at the 2017, which we'll talk about some highlights of that, we see the Hamas expressing itself much more explicitly with civic aspirations, very explicitly defining the people, the territory, what they want to do, the principles of democracy, pluralism, things that they're going to use as the basis for their rule or their government if they're in place. The 1988 charter is much more rooted in the Quran, and there's like superfluous, and I love the Quran, I love the Hadith, but there is so much reference in every article to the Quran and the Hadith, and they don't always necessarily make easy sense. It sometimes seems like a stretch, but it's much more rooted in the ideology and the ideas of the Quran than it is in sort of the practical of governing. In the 2017, it doesn't abandon its commitment to Islam. It's in there. It starts and it ends with the Quran, and it references the idea of the Ummah, the Muslim community. But there's references explicitly at the beginning and the end, and the Quran is not quoted and Hadith are not quoted all the way through. So it's definitely trying to make itself look more structured, more like a secular document that the nation state kind of modern secular world will take a look at and take more seriously. Hamas's charter initially speaks much more to an internal community that is the internal community of Muslims and Palestinians, and sort of like what it thinks will fuel their angst and their anger and their frustration to be motivated. Whereas I would say that the 2017 charter speaks both to the Palestinian community and Palestinian parties, right, to create a unity government, and an international audience. So if you read it, it's much more aimed to put the international audience at ease. So as I said, there's an emphasis on ideology in the Islamic world in the various pieces of the charter. And so to give you a sense of that, in the first, almost the first 2 pages of the charter, so I've got it 2 pages per, so it's very tiny. But almost the first 2 pages of the charter, the original charter, is quotations from the Quran and less about like what it wants to do and why it needs to exist. Whereas the other document says this is a document of general principles and policies. Praise be to Allah, the Lord of the worlds. May all the peace and blessings of Allah be upon Muhammad, the master of messengers, the leader of the Mujahideen, and upon his household and his companions. That's it. And then it says its preamble, Palestine is the land of the Arab Palestinian people, and from it they originate, and to it they adhere and belong, and about it they reach out and communicate. Very quickly shifts gears to the question of Palestine and what is supposed to happen with Palestine. That is the piece of it that is essential. The Hamas Charter condemns very specific international decisions. It says it rejects the 242, it rejects the Balfour Declaration, partition plans, and all of those kinds of things. And it also says it rejects capitalist West and the communist East. It's working in that non-alignment framework That is, they want to assert like their own kind of individual sense of sovereignty, and neither the capitalist West or the communist East are going to be the framework in which it's operating. Whereas in the newer version, it emphasizes, it does not divide the world East and West, and it condemns specific decisions, and the Oslo Accords says it nullifies these. These are not working for us. We're not going to use them. So it's updating what it's worried about. But it doesn't sort of define it in these ideological capitalist terms, communist terms. It frames it almost exclusively in this idea of like sovereignty and the ability of self-determination. And this is further emphasized in its emphasis on plurality, like pluralism, democracy, free and fair elections, all things that we hear about when it comes to like what is a good election, what is a good democratic society that's acceptable to the international order. And the other one, the earlier version, emphasis of social responsibility in the context of Islam, over and over again referencing the idea of the Ummah, that is the Muslim community, and how they work together, and how Islam provides a way for serving one another and nurturing the community. Okay. It rejects secularism in that earlier version. And in the 2017 charter, it much more kind of makes, Hroub says even by 2006, but it extends the opportunity to cooperate with the Palestinian Authority. It says, yeah, this is not the ideal way, but we recognize that the Palestinian Authority is seen by many people as a valuable and legitimate form of like its idea. We think you all are corrupt and your leadership needs change, but we recognize that the Palestinian Authority has significance and meaning for the people of Palestine, and so we're willing to work with them. So that's kind of the language that they use to describe this. The other one, 1988 charter, is a very loose conflation of Zionism and Judaism. So the early one does reference Zionism as distinct from Judaism, but then they get loosey-goosey with their language and conflate the idea of Jews and Zionism, particularly with some of their quotes from the Hadith that sort of sound very like Judgment Day in what they're referencing, because they're trying to talk about conflict and fighting, and that's the moment where you see that in the Quran, right? That's what it references. And so there's a lot of that. Whereas in this new 2017 charter, it is very explicitly over and over again says that it will not, that it doesn't have a problem with Judaism, that Jews who are not Zionists are welcome to live with and among them, and that, you know, the future is that their fight is with Zionism and the Zionist entity, and not with Judaism and Jews specifically. So they make that over and over again quite explicit, right? As an attempt, I think, in part, I mean, I can't speak to what's in their hearts, but certainly as an outward-facing document, it is meant to assure the international community that they are not out for Jews generally, but specifically Zionism. And so that's something that we hear very different in that document. The documents are available. I want to hone in on, let you all ask some questions, and then I can talk about like some specific language in the document that meets whatever is the most interesting to you, but this is a framework for you to maybe compare yourself in detail later on. But so I'll open it up to questions for folks, but I'm happy to go on about these fascinating documents. So
is there anything that like, or I guess any events around 2017 that made them like bring that new charter around then, or like was it just kind of like in the works, you know?
I think it was sort of with a goal, you know, I don't know if there was any one event that sort of started that. We can already see it in 2006. And so I think that Hroub's article, if you look it up, sort of says, I look at these three documents. He says, first, the platform for running for government, then the unity cabinet proposal that they put together, and then sort of another. So he looks at three documents that are pertain to that election, and you can already see them significantly shifting in this direction. And so what I suspect is that when what seems to be the case is that when they didn't get the new elections, they sort of put this platform together as a way to reassure for moving forward with elections. So I think that it was partially driven by that more than any like one event. Other thoughts, questions?
So just a couple of questions that are just really fascinating about these texts. I guess I was kind of wondering about within the community or within the context of Gaza, like what is the significance of the charter? Are initially in 1988, are they producing this charter because Fatah or the other parties that they're competing against have sort of charters of their own, and this is a distillation? And I guess is the charter kind of is it important within Gaza, or is it also important because of the way that the charter gets seen in the West?
So I think the first one is really important for Palestine specifically, right?
Right.
They formed, they got this going, and they immediately distributed leaflets wherever they could. And so it was very much meant to be on the ground, recruiting people to the resistance. And so it was focused, I think, very much on the internal document. And it's like, this is why you should join our side rather than the PLO side. This is why you should come to us. We're going to do these things. PLO is starting to show corruption. They don't even live in the country anymore. All of these kinds of things. They were a government in exile from the 70s onward, right? So that was part of it. Now, I think this is very much an outward facing document. And I think I should say it's two things. It is both inward facing and outward facing. The part is that they recognize, or Hroub argues, that they really recognize that the strategy of like one-sidedness and fighting the PA is not going to win. It's not going to win. It's not going to win as a strategy, and it's not going to against Israel, and it's not going to win as a strategy among Palestinians. Palestinians were exhausted, didn't want to fight anymore. 2006, they were exhausted from the second Intifada. And sort of the economic downturn that's going to come along and all of those kinds of things that's going to make life even harder. And so Hroub argues that they really do start to see the desire for, like, while Palestinians might wish for and dream for a homeland, a state that isn't the entire homeland is at least something, right? And you can figure out what happens after that, but a state is a state, and Palestinians are like ready for a state. And so I think it's a bit of a nod to Palestinians that we're looking for something that is winnable. And we don't want to see Palestinians fighting among ourselves anymore. We want to see if there's a way that we can bring ourselves together. That's the message that they're sending out both to Palestinians and to the international community in some ways. Yeah. Others? Questions? Anybody in the audience out there? Wish you have more questions. Go for it.
In your opinion, as a historian, for future historians, what are the sources out there for what future historians will be able to know about how these charters get actually sort of drafted? Like, will there be documentation of those conversations? Do you think that there will be maybe interviews or people in memoirs? I would just love to.
Yeah.
How much is being lost with the destruction?
Right.
Well, right now, so hard to say, right? So in the West Bank, there's a lot of documentation. A lot of the arguments back and forth are taking place in the UN and so the stuff that's happening in the West Bank, that's probably for now at least safe. And the stuff that happens in international, whatever. Yes, I think people do within 10 to 20 years issue their memoirs. And so it's possible we see that. One of the things that is key about Hamas is that there are a number of people who are, part of the government lives in exile, like lives in Qatar. And so, that stuff is available. Qatar, the UN, the US, whatever, whoever's in happening with these talks are part and parcel of those things. And so that part is preserved. But the other part of I mean, everything in Gaza is lost at this point, as far as we can tell. I mean, they've destroyed every university. They've destroyed every library. I can't imagine what document has survived some of this stuff. I mean, well, miraculously some things, and it will be, but yeah, imagining what we're going to have access to, I don't know. Now, some of this stuff is happening over the internet. I'm sure they're using all kinds of fancy encrypted things. But you know, what that means for us in terms of, yeah, it'll be hard to say what is being preserved and what's not. And it'll be as it is with most things. Mostly we'll only have access to stuff that's in public bodies and institutions handled back and forth until at some point down the road, 20 years from now, somebody releases their memoirs and that kind of thing. Yeah. Well, we have now hit just past 5:45. So I am happy to answer any more questions if you have them, but I'm also willing to recognize that you've had very long days and some of you still have more long day ahead of you with your classes. But all of you, I will be posting this on YouTube. And so if you actually want to get the links, you're in here, you can grab them in the next day or so. You can click on them and you'll be able to access them. They're easily available, searchable, but these are 2 solid copies that I know haven't been messed with. So, yeah. All right. Thank you. And for any of you, next one is Oslo.